Hello, everyone. It's Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ. Welcome to today's user share webinar. We're going to be talking about the EUC State of the Union for 2021. I don't know if any of you had a chance to see Marius's 2020 State of the Union last year, but I have the recording from last year. You're definitely welcome to go back to CUGC and check it out, and I can put a link in the chat in just a little bit for you to that recording, but I am definitely excited to hear what he has to say today. I know he has a lot of content to get through for us, so I'm going to go pretty fast through this couple of slides here. Just wanted to point out a couple of events that we have coming up. As you can see, we have several of our local group meetings happening today. Central and Western New York are combined. Poland, actually, I think they're actually over already. They already had theirs. Twin Cities and Utah. So if you're in any of those locations or curious about them, definitely head over to our events calendar and register. Also next week, CUGC will have a booth at the Citrix Healthcare Summit. If you're going to be there, check it out. Come by and say hello. We'd love to see you. And also next week, Goliath is doing a webinar with us on the top 3 painful end user experience issues in 2021. I sense a common theme here. So hopefully you'll check that out as well. James Rankin is going to team up with the Goliath folks and talk about that. All right, so just a couple of housekeeping details for you. We are recording today's presentation and you'll get a link to that. It's gonna come to you directly from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. Should get to you tomorrow. Please submit your questions in the question box. You can type them in at any time. I think we're gonna save them for the end of the presentation, but type them in as you have them so that you don't forget. And also hang on at the end because I do have a trivia question I'm going to ask you. And the first 3 people to answer the question correctly will win a CUGC cup. So don't leave too soon. All right, so I'm about to hand things right over. We have Marius Sandbu with us. He is the Guild Lead for Public Cloud. And I think, Marius, I'm not sure if I'm going to say the company name correctly. Is it Tieto Every?
That is correct.
Yay, I did it. It's not hard, I know, but sometimes. He's also a CTP alumnus, so he's going to be going through all this wonderful content for us today. And then keeping an eye on your questions for us is Jake Walsh. He is a CTA. He's the principal consultant at CDW UK. Hello, Jake.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Yeah, really good presentation coming up. So fire off your questions and we'll do our best to answer them.
All right, Marius, I am going to send you the screen right now so that you can get going with all your stuff. Here it comes.
So let's make sure that we show the right screen.
Yes, I think so.
There we go. So, hello everybody and welcome to this webinar session. And as Stephanie said, this is a follow-up of last year's 2020 edition, where I'm actually going to go through a lot of the technology changes and updates that have been going on within the end user computing space the last year. So I was on what we was just discussing. This is like was only a couple of days ago that we shared like a sad 1-year anniversary working from home, as like many of us has been doing the last year. So of course we have been in a situation now where a lot of organizations on a global scale now suddenly needed to shift the way they worked and how they access applications and services. So of course we'll be going through all of that different content, what the different vendors are talking about, working on. And of course, Microsoft Ignite happened last week. So of course, there's a lot of announcements there as well, which I want to go through. But again, it's a lot of content that I want to cover. So hopefully I'll have most of the cool stuff that I want to talk about as part of this session. Now, of course, one of the big issues that have been most organizations have been struggling with the last year is of course ransomware attacks. And of course, I want to talk about this because this is essentially it's been a problem from an end user perspective that organizations are targeted directly using phishing campaigns and so on. So we talk a little bit about that. Also talk a little bit about the vendors' focus areas when it comes to zero trust-based architecture, talking about the new acronym from Gartner called the SASE. I think that's the way it's pronounced, but we'll go back to that and what kind of functionality the different vendors are focusing on moving forward. Also talk a little bit about modern authentication mechanism and passwordless authentication, which was now recently general available from Microsoft. Talk a little bit about different analytics engines and threat intelligence mechanisms, both from Citrix, VMware, and Microsoft. Also go through some updates when it comes to the different cloud providers, mostly looking at it from an end user computing aspect, so new functionality, features, and so on. And also looking into the different updates from VMware, Citrix, and Microsoft from a VDI perspective. And of course, we need to talk also a little bit about Windows Virtual Desktop, what's been going on there the last year, and also look a little bit closer at the ecosystem that they now provide. And lastly, look into recap from Ignite. So of course, there's a lot of focus here on technical content, new capabilities, new features that the vendors have been adding the last year. But hopefully at the end, we'll try to summarize and give a bird's eye view of where we see that the end user computing aspect is, or if the end user computing space is moving forward. So as also mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in a Q&A window, and me and Jake will go through them after the end of this session. Now, of course, a couple of things that I want to mention before I start on the main part of the agenda, just to save some of you some hours to actually struggle or figure this one out on your own. I was working on a project right after Christmas where I was struggling with setting up something that I've been doing so many times before, but for some reason I was getting this error message: cannot complete your request. So actually setting up a traditional Citrix environment, setting up storefront, making sure the authentication mechanism was working, but in one specific Netscaler ADC or Citrix ADC build, Citrix made a change on the single sign-on authentication mechanisms within Netscaler Gateway. So they essentially disabled non-secure authentication mechanisms. So this feature or this error message only applies for this specific firmware version. So if you are struggling with this setup, it will not happen on the later or the newer versions. And there is a support knowledge base article from Citrix which showcases how you can actually fix this to make sure that it works. The second thing I want to mention, and of course, I live in Norway, so I'm not particularly proud of this specific incident right now, but of course, there is a lot of focus on the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability that has been known now for a couple of weeks. Of course, the Norwegian Parliament came out yesterday saying that data was stolen as part of the Microsoft Exchange attack. So attackers have been leveraging that vulnerability, getting access to data and exfiltrating some data. Now, looking at the timeline, which is still a little bit fuzzy, but it seems that the attack started already back in January. So if you have an Exchange environment, please make sure that you look for any type of indicators, or if you see any traces of compromise on your environment. Make sure that those web shells that have been using or leveraging, make sure that those are closed, and make sure that you're not targeted for any future attacks. Because what we saw yesterday afternoon is that now new exploits are coming out which can leverage the same vulnerability. So just a couple of things I wanted to get out of the way before we start on the main agenda. So for one of the main things that I saw after COVID started is that a lot of organizations, enterprises, and a lot of specifically customers based out of the Nordics, where our company primary focus areas, we saw that a lot of customers wants to move to a desktop as a service offering. So instead of having a traditional VDI application delivery system where they are responsible for the entire layer, they want to move to a cloud-based desktop as a service offering. That way they can focus more on their core business, and the desktop itself is managed by the cloud provider. And we see now that more and more of these vendors are wanting to provide this kind of capability. Even Microsoft now is moving up the stack and wants to provide this as a service, but I'll get back to that in a later part of the slide deck. So of course, Gartner sees that, okay, this is something that's going to increase quite rapidly the next couple of years. And of course, with the desktop as a service offering, of course, you lose the customization or the ability to customize every aspect of the setup. You need to be locked into a specific delivery model. Of course, you have the option to provide your custom image or not with custom applications. You can integrate it with your existing network. But of course, you lose some of the flexibility that you have with a traditional VDI delivery system. But again, regardless if you use desktop as a service or if you use traditional VDI services, one of the main things and main issues that have been the last year is, of course, security. And I'm guessing many of us, including myself, have been quite busy when it comes to patching. Exchange, Microsoft Exchange being one of those issues, but we've also seen vulnerabilities in Windows. We have the reverse DDoS exploit in the Citrix NetScaler appliances, RDP protocols. We also now see the aftermath of the SolarWinds attack and how attackers managed to compromise the source code of a specific product. So of course, a lot of these vulnerabilities that are coming out now are often also used for ransomware purposes. So attackers are finding organizations that have vulnerable Exchange or vulnerable remote access devices to actually try to compromise their infrastructure to get access. And unfortunately, what we see is that ransomware is becoming big business. So they're targeting a lot of organizations, and I think the latest statistics were that these types of attacks are happening every 11th second. So during this talk, I think there's close to 250 organizations now that have been targeted for these types of attacks. Now, most attacks start with a phishing email, getting a user to click on a URL or opening an attachment to actually be able to compromise the end user device itself. And of course, once the attackers actually gain access to one specific device, then they use that device to try to get further access to inside the infrastructure. But of course, they're also using this in combination with multiple different attack vectors. One being vulnerabilities that they can use, brute force attacks. So typically they have like a dictionary of username and password and try to see if they manage to get access with one of those different user accounts or user information. They also use something called credential stuffing. So if they manage to get a hold of your user accounts or user information from a third-party website that can compromise, they also typically use that to try to get access. Of course, once they get access to get inside, then they have a lot of logic and scripts in place to actually try to figure out how the network, the infrastructure is built up. And of course, the main goal is to get access to the Active Directory domain controllers. That way they can encrypt or infect as much systems as possible. Of course, the main goal is to be able to encrypt data, leave a ransom note. We need to pay either types of cryptocurrency to get access to a decryption tool to actually decrypt your data. Most of these attacks, of course, are aimed at Windows-based environments. So Active Directory, they leverage a lot of the protocols there, and also administrative tools such as PCExec, PowerShell. But we also have seen now in recent weeks that they also have been using vulnerabilities in VMware ESXi to actually also be able to encrypt data on a VMware level, but also targeting other operating systems as well. But one of the main issues that we see is that I think there was, I don't remember the name of the company, but they specialize in vulnerability research. And they saw that if you compare 2019 to 2020, there's a lot more high severity vulnerabilities in 2020 compared to 2019. And now we're already in only in March, and we've already seen a lot of high level severity vulnerabilities happening already. Now, of course, so the main goal is to encrypt data. Of course, a lot of us or a lot of organizations now are getting quite prepared when it comes to these types of attacks and having good backup mechanisms in place to be able to restore data. And then you can be quite up and running quite quickly. And I think it was the CTO of F-Secure which talked a little bit about the trends, and what he said is the attackers now are changing tactics. And he dubbed it ransomware 2.0, where the attackers are now just not encrypting data, they're also getting data or copying data out to their own servers and saying that, okay, if you want to get access to your data, if you don't want us to publish this data on the internet, you need to pay us X amount of Bitcoin. Or I've also seen scenarios where they set up type of online auction. So the company needs to pay to actually make sure that the information is not published online. So of course, the main question is traditional two-factor authentication mechanisms now enough to actually ensure our infrastructure or remote access in? And no, the answer is no. Because what we see is that even the remote access solutions, such VPN and Citrix NetScaler, even F5 Big IP, which we saw had a high severity vulnerability, came out yesterday. When those two-factor authentication mechanisms or the perimeter security service itself is vulnerable, then we are really struggling with how to make sure everything is secure. So this is, of course, where the zero trust architecture comes in. So zero trust is essentially saying that, okay, regardless of where the user is located, if it's coming from a domain joined device or coming from a home office device, or if it's placed in the office or not, I don't trust you anyhow. So the mechanism here is that it essentially treats everyone as hostile, regardless of where you're coming in from. So if you want to get access to either set of applications or data, then you need to fulfill different security requirements that we've defined. And of course, in order to do this, we collect a lot of risk indicators from the identity itself, so where the user is trying to authenticate from. We can define different mechanisms in place to have multi-factor authentication if it's coming from a known country. If we have threat intelligence information saying that this user is compromised or not. And in addition, we also collect information from the device. So typical EDR features or endpoint detection and response tools that sit on the device to actually see what's going on. And we will also look at, okay, is the VM or the endpoint running antivirus? Is it's patched to the latest version? So all these different risk indicators are being collected into the main security policy engine, if you will, which is then also enriched with threat intelligence information. And based upon the security policy that we define, we can determine if a user, based upon a certain risk, is allowed access to applications or not. And of course, this evaluation is not only at authentication or where the session is actually created, it's continuously running in the background. So if it sees any risk indicators from a specific compromised endpoint or from the user itself, it can disconnect a session or access to that specific application. Now I can also look, as part of the architecture, they can also look into the session. So what is the user actually doing? So if, for instance, one specific user, okay, all the risk indicators say that there's nothing wrong with this connection, so the user is allowed access, but suddenly 2 a.m. on a Sunday night, they start to download 2,000 files from OneDrive, well, something's going on. So this is also something that a zero trust-based architecture can prohibit these types of data exfiltration. But of course, to be able to understand what's normal and not normal traffic patterns and traffic behavior, it requires a lot of data. So it requires that you collect a lot of data from all the different data tools in place, data sources, and so on. And of course, even though zero trust itself, it's not a product or something that you can buy, but of course, you need to have technology underneath to support this type of architecture. Now, Zero Trust is also a reference architecture now that's is available on the NIST framework. So it goes through a very vendor neutral way, talking about these different types of security mechanisms. One thing that is interesting, though, is that all of the different vendors within the EUC space is now jumping aboard this train, focusing on, okay, how we can provide zero trust-based access as part of our products. And of course, of course, zero trust is one core component of a new acronym, which I learned about, I think it was one close to a year ago, called SASE. I think that's the way it's pronounced. It stands for Secure Access Service Edge. I think it's a Gartner term, but anyhow, it's a combination, or it's a new architectural model for how we can deliver access from an end user perspective to applications and data, and also combination with network and security mechanisms. So often these types of these different services are bundled together, delivered as a cloud service from one or more vendors to protect end user access and also optimize network access to different applications or services. So of course, as I said, SASE consists of multiple different packages, different products. One is of course the zero trust based access. And one example that we have here is like Azure Active Directory, which can provide this type of continuous evaluation of risk. Another option, another tool, a product that's typically also involves something is SD-WAN, so optimizing the traffic that the end user or the end user client takes to actually access that specific cloud service. Now, since most of these different tools are bundled together as a cloud service from a vendor, they also go through something, a secure web gateway, which actually will intercept the traffic going from the end user's browser to that specific cloud service, where you can have different DLP policies, URL filtering, so a lot of different firewall mechanisms in place, so to make sure that data is not exfiltrated and so on. And then another typical component that which is in here, something called Cloud Access Security Broker, which is has an API integration to the different cloud services to actually see what's going on from an outside perspective. So these are just some of the packages that SASE product consists of. Of course, it is dependent on what kind of vendor you're looking into. So I did some research and looked into, okay, what kind of products do the three main different vendors provide in terms of these capabilities. So I looked into Microsoft, Citrix, and VMware. Of course, as I talked about, Microsoft, they have Active Directory conditional access, which can do this zero trust identity-based access, so continuous evaluation of risk. Citrix and VMware also have similar capabilities. They can also leverage information from conditional access, which I'll come back to a little bit later. Of course, it's also depending on what kind of identity service you actually use. So if I use a radius-based authentication mechanism, I am completely dependent that the radius provider itself is able to collect this risk indicators to actually determine if I'm allowed access or not. Of course, different vendors also have different management capabilities to manage small devices, endpoints. Microsoft and VMware as well, they have EDR capabilities, so they can actually see what's going on the endpoint in more in-depth. So what kind of processes, if there's running malicious scripts or payloads on the endpoint as well. So they can report these types of risk indicators back to the zero trust identity access solution to actually make sure that, okay, machines with specific or suspicious payload running should not be given access to any type of data or application. And then we have Secure Web Gateway, which is, as I said, providing DLP functionality within the session. Microsoft uses a combination of Cloud App Security and Defender ADP. Citrix is now something they call Secure Workspace Access. Unless they changed the names recently, because there's a lot of product renaming here. VMware, on the other hand, they don't have this built-in capability, so they've been partnering up with a third party called Menlo, which will provide this type of same functionality. Both Citrix and VMware provide cloud firewall capabilities to protect traffic going against on-premise environments. That's not something Microsoft provides at the moment. Same for remote browser solutions. And also when it comes to SD-WAN capabilities, which both Citrix and VMware provides. Now, Microsoft has something called Azure Virtual WAN, but that's only applicable for traffic going into Microsoft Azure. And then, of course, is the last part, threat intelligence. So what kind of risk indicators can these three different vendors actually use to actually look into if there's known IP addresses that are communicating with specific services? So I've also took a closer look at the different, let's say, threat intelligence mechanisms that these two main vendors have. So Citrix has a product called Citrix Analytics for Security. So what it actually does, this is a cloud service. So it collects all the data from the different Citrix components, virtual apps, desktops, endpoint management, the Citrix network, and so on. So it collects this information and uses it to establish a baseline of what's normal traffic patterns. It can also collect information from the Microsoft Graph API. So if Microsoft sees any risk indicators, that will also be able to be collected into Citrix Analytics. And then we can use this data that's coming in to actually automatically block access to a Citrix environment if a user is compromised in Azure Active Directory, for instance. Now, VMware also provides the same type of functionality. within something called Workspace ONE Intelligence Risk Analytics. They really need to focus on their naming, but provides the same functionality. So it collects a lot of data, be able to establish a baseline. It can also collect information from Carbon Black Cloud, which is their EDR capability. And VMware also has something they call VMware Threat Network. So it's different partners that they can integrate with to also collect this type of information. So they have a lot more risk indicators to be able to determine if a user should be allowed access or not. So this is, of course, from a security perspective. And one of the key things I find interesting is that all of these vendors are also focusing on analytics or data collection to actually give us more insight into what's going on. And again, Citrix also has a similar product under the analytics umbrella called Citrix Analytics for Performance, where it collects performance metrics, information about user sessions from Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops and Citrix Gateway to actually give us indication of what's the overall health or what's going on with our user sessions, or what's the overall end user experience. VMware also has a similar one, but it's more aimed at the endpoints itself. So what's the overall health for a Windows 10 devices, if they're having blue screens or application compatibility issues. Then we, of course, from a Microsoft perspective, they have a lot of different analytics mechanisms, one being desktop analytics, which is primarily used for looking into if there are application compatibility issues or if we have issues for upgrading from an older Windows version to Windows 10. And then we have Workspace Analytics, which is part of Microsoft 365. Gives you information of overall collaboration status, gives you information about when you should or how many hours you have to actually focus this week. So it collects information from Teams and so on to see how much meetings you have and how much time is actually spent on collaboration. And the last one is Desktop Analytics, which is for Windows 10 devices, can either be used on System Center or Intune or Endpoint Manager. Actually look into what's the overall device health on our endpoints. So look at blue screen, if there's machines with blue screens, boot time taking too long, or startup time taking too long. This is the type of information that these types of, or this endpoint analytics engine collects and shows. So of course, a lot of analytics and a lot of different information now making it easier for us to actually determine of how is the overall status for our end user environment. And then we have passwordless authentication, which has been in preview for some time and became generally available at Ignite last week. So what essentially it does is allow you to authenticate to Azure Active Directory without the use of a password. So you can use a security key or you can use the Azure Authenticator app. So typically use that you have a UB key or something that you can insert into your device and you can provide single sign-on mechanisms into Azure Active Directory. And of course, that means that any application that is integrated with Azure AD will also get single sign-on. This is now also supported for hybrid scenarios, so working against traditional Active Directory, and provides authentication mechanisms for Windows integrated applications, NTLM, and IIS as well. But it requires that you make some upgrades on your domain controllers. I think it's up to, you need to have 2016 or 2019 domain controllers, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, this mechanism can also then be used for Citrix and VMware, so remote access purposes. For Citrix, you need to have the federated authentication service in place, and you need to integrate that with Azure Active Directory. Same with VMware. When it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop, however, you don't get the full single sign-on experience. You can log on to the web front end using this type of passwordless authentication, but until Microsoft solves that full SSO mechanism in the back, it's only going to get you halfway there. So that is also a good introduction to go into what's new with Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, so a lot has happened the last year. One thing is that Windows Virtual Desktop became Azure native citizen, and I think it was in March. So it's now part of Azure Resource Manager, which opens up a lot of possibilities from an automation perspective. And another thing is that they also now opened up for storing the metadata in West Europe as well, because previously, regardless if you had your VDI sessions in West Europe or Norway data center or in Asia, the metadata would always be stored in one of the data centers in the US. But now it's fortunately opened up for storing this in Europe. They also introduced a new capability called RDP short path. Now, the traffic flow from a regular Windows Virtual Desktop connection from an end user perspective will always go through the Windows Virtual Desktop control plane, where they have their centralized gateway component, which will then communicate with the VDI in the backend. So what short path does is essentially bypass the centralized gateway, but it requires that you have direct sight between the end user client and the VDI session. So typically used is that we have a combination with ExpressRoute or any type of VPN connectivity. We've also added support for Microsoft Defender for endpoints for Windows 10 multi-session. MSIX app attach is now in public preview, so it means that you can assign MSIX applications directly from the portal. They've also added screen protection capture mechanisms, and they've also focused a lot on Azure Monitor for Windows Virtual Desktop, so providing built-in monitoring and dashboard capabilities within Azure. So instead of you needing to build up that logic on your own. Another thing is that they're also deploying Windows Virtual Desktop control planes now into more Azure regions. So the simplest way to check if you have a control plane within your closest Azure region, you can go into this website called Virtual Desktop Assessment. It will do a check from your browser to find the closest Azure region available where they have the control plane in place. So for me in Norway, we had this control plane deployed, I think it was in December or November. It also comes with support for Microsoft Teams. Zoom is also supported as well. A final thing that is feature that is coming is something called Start on User Connect. So that means that when a user is actually connecting or logging into the Windows Virtual Desktop web portal and starting on a session or click on an application or desktop, that will actually start the virtual machine in Azure instead of being able to run all the time, because in Azure, you're paying for a VM per second that it's running. Of course, the Start on User Connect will be a lot helpful when it comes to saving money on infrastructure in Azure. Now, of course, there's been a lot of updates from Microsoft when it comes to features and functionality in Windows Virtual Desktop. There's also been a lot of updates when it comes to the overall ecosystem. And one thing that we see is that, okay, when you're moving to using Windows Virtual Desktop, you're essentially also moving into the Azure ecosystem. So using that makes a lot of changes to your toolbox in terms of how you do management, how you do deployment, monitoring, and so on. And of course, Microsoft is focusing heavily on using the Azure native functionality. But again, with this ecosystem now, there's also third-party management capabilities such as Nerdio and others that can also be used to abstract away all the complexity what comes with Azure. So there's a lot of management tools now. There's also a big ecosystem when it comes to support for third-party vendors. I think there was a couple of new Fin clients that announced support for VVD last week. There's also a lot of great community offerings as well when it comes to both management, smart scripts to actually scale services up and down as well. So I think in the end, you need to figure out, okay, do I want to invest fully into the Azure ecosystem and the tools there, or do I want to use a third-party management solution instead, or a combination, of course. Then we have feature updates from Citrix. Of course, there's been a lot of updates there as well. One thing is something called the service continuity for Citrix Cloud, essentially meaning that if, for instance, the Citrix Workspace service would be unavailable, or previously at least, the end users would get an error message saying that they wouldn't be able to communicate with Citrix Cloud. But as part of service continuity, what Citrix actually made is that the client itself is running as a progressive web app, so it will be caching a lot of information locally on the client. So even though the workspace might be unavailable, or some VDI sessions might be unavailable, the user is still being able to access the workspace and see all the applications. And of course, depending on what kind of services that are not available, should also be able to access the specific application. Also made some updates to Web Studio now, so instead of going into Citrix Cloud and then opening a Microsoft MMC console and opening Studio there, you can now do a lot of these same functionalities directly in the web portal. They've also come with support for storing images that you have against Microsoft Azure in something called Azure's Shared Image Library, which is essentially Microsoft's own centralized imaging service. So it can do versioning. It can also synchronize images across different Azure regions. And then we have the rendezvous protocol. Now the traffic flow in Citrix Cloud is that when a user connects if a customer is using NetScaler Gateway as a service, the end user will connect to a gateway service that Citrix is hosting down to the Citrix Cloud connector and then into the VDI session. Now with the rendezvous protocol, what it's actually doing is bypassing the cloud connector and talking directly to the VDI session. So dropping at least one hop and saving some latency on the way. Then we of course have drag and drop, which is an incredible new functionality, which allows you to drag and drop files across the session and your local desktop. They've also added virtual biometric authentications, which means that if you're running a Citrix session and you want to use single sign-on or passwordless authentication in the virtual session, which would need that you would need to insert your YubiKey into the virtual session, as is now supported as well. And then we also have something called the automatic configuration tool, which allows you also to export configuration from any on-premises Citrix virtual apps and desktop and import it into a Citrix Cloud environment. So saving a lot of hassle there when it comes to moving configuration policies, application publishment assignments, and so on. And I also think it was last week that Citrix announced support for any type of authentication or any type of SAML provider as part of Citrix Cloud as well. And then we have VMware. Of course, one of the main things they introduced, I think it was at VMworld last year, they also introduced something they call the Freestyle Orchestrator as part of UEM, which allows you to create this type of visual workflows in terms of what should happen in terms of application installation and so on. They also now integrate with conditional access, so you can collect risk indicators or use conditional access rules as part to apply to access to any VMware-based environment as well. And they also focused on something they call Intelligence Hub, where they now provide something called employee onboarding, which can automate setup of user accounts in HR systems, give the end user information in terms of access to training videos, access to applications, and so on. So it's type of a workflow that the user will be presented on the first day. And of course, copy and paste between sessions. It's not drag and drop, but it is copy and paste at least. So they're moving in the right direction. Another thing is mobile flow integration, and this is something that I talked on the the session last year. Is that Citrix, of course, they focus a lot on micro apps. So instead of getting users to be able to access all the applications, what you're essentially doing is surfacing the action that you want users to take. This is now something VMware is doing as well with the mobile flow integration. And then we also have application volumes, which was separate components, separate infrastructure. It's now available on the VMware Horizon on Azure as well. MSI app attach management is now also supported in VMware Cloud on app volumes. And they are also now rolling out their control plane into different locations as well. So I don't remember which kind of locations that was added, but they are rolling out new regions each month or each second month, I believe. So of course, looking into when it comes to cloud support, because I get a lot of questions from organizations. Okay, what kind? I'm going into this specific cloud provider, and I need to have a VDI delivery mechanism. So what kind of provider can I use? Of course, Windows Virtual Desktop is only supported as of now on Azure. It is technically possible to use any cloud provider, but I don't think that's going to be likely from a licensing perspective anytime soon. Citrix Cloud, of course, provides access to all of these different cloud platforms. I've also included different VMware options here, even though they're pretty much the same underneath. VMware, however, has been focusing a lot on Azure. now, and they also have a lot of information when it comes to building or delivering this as part of VMware on AWS. But of course, specifically if you look into Azure as one specific platform here, now Windows Virtual Desktop, they don't have any built-in provisioning mechanisms, but Citrix and VMware provides provisioning mechanisms on Azure as well. So when it comes to Azure and Microsoft 365 updates, a lot of new capabilities there. Seem already running too short on time, but Azure Firewall Premium provides ID and IPS functionality and TLS inspection. It's still in preview, but it allows you to actually inspect the traffic going east and west and outbound for any Azure-based environment. We have Microsoft Tunnel, which I'll come to in a separate slide, but essentially a mobile-based VPN solution. And this has now been bundled together with Microsoft Defender for endpoints as well. So that was something that became announced at Ignite last week. Microsoft now is also extending the DLP functionality to support software as a service applications and also Windows endpoints as well. So if you have a Windows 10 device, the DLP engine, which is based upon Azure Information Protection, will also work on the endpoint as well, so not just within Office 365. From an infrastructure perspective, and one of the cool new things that we've been looking into is performance tier changes on SSD disks in Azure. So if you have an application that's running sluggish, you can change the tier on your SSD drive without any downtime to see if the performance increase fixes the issue or not. One final thing I want to mention here is the Azure routing preferences, which became GA, I think it was yesterday or the day before that. What it actually does is that it optimizes to how traffic is going into the Azure environment. Because by default, when an end user is connecting to a specific Azure service, it will go through the local ISP and then follow the ISP route to the Azure service, which might be located in West Europe. If you're using routing preferences, it will go through from an end user to the ISP and then to the closest Azure point of presence available. So it might be that you have an Azure data center nearby or in a close proximity or one of the Microsoft POPs, and then we'll then use the Azure backbone to connect to the Azure service. When it comes to Amazon and Google Cloud, of course, not so much has happened here. I don't think this is the same focus area that others have. But of course, Amazon is now provided a new streaming protocol, which is pretty much similar to what Citrix did with FrameHawk in a couple of years ago. I actually think the creator of FrameHawk is now working in Amazon, so I think that's a connection there. But now providing this new streaming protocol in addition to PCR IP as well. So they have two different protocols they can work on. They also now provided Mac, based on Mac Mini, so you can order Mac Mini as part of an EC2 instance. And they also now support smart card-based authentication. From Google Cloud, they of course made some changed some product names, but they also now announced something called Beyond Corp Enterprise, which essentially provides zero trust-based access to any type of application. Of course, this is not something that Google can do on their own, but they are leaning on different partners to provide this type of capability. But essentially, from an end user perspective, what you actually need to do is you need to have browser, the Google Chrome browser, and you need to have an extension installed. And then we have Microsoft Tunnel, which is a mobile-based VPN appliance. So essentially running as a Docker container on Linux, and it's now supported for iOS and Android. And as part of, after Ignite, it was integrated with the Microsoft Defender app. So it's coming as public preview soon. But in order to actually get access to this VPN solution, which can either be on a per application level or provide full tunnel access, you need to authenticate to Azure Active Directory first. So that means any type of conditional access mechanisms that you have will also apply when it comes to getting access to this VPN tunnel. And of course, it will automatically be updated when Microsoft releases a new version. Also, when it comes to Citrix NetScaler ADC, a lot of new capabilities here. One of the main things I want to highlight is the always-on VPN functionality, which has been part of NetScaler for some time, but now they actually also support machine tunnels so that the VPN tunnel can be established before the user is actually logging on. And we also now, as part of cloud-based deployments for Citrix NetScaler, you can also add a previewed customization script. So you can essentially define what kind of configuration I want to add, and when I deploy the Citrix ADC appliance, it will automatically apply a specific configuration file that I've pre-configured. So just going to go through this a little bit quickly so I have some time for Q&A. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit over time. When it comes to browsers, still an important aspect. There's been a lot of updates here from Microsoft. They've included password monitoring mechanisms now, so you can detect if there's any indication of compromised or leaked passwords. From a VDI perspective, they've included sleeping tabs, so you can reduce inactive tabs and store it into storage instead of having it placed in memory. And I think it was last week they also introduced something called Startup Boost, which starts the browser in the background once the user actually signs in. And also now include a lot of new security mechanisms as well. And of course, they also, Microsoft has now been kind enough to introduce disable Internet Explorer as a standalone browser feature or a group policy setting as well. This is quite helpful because I think it was 2 days ago, we saw a new vulnerability in Internet Explorer 11. So I'm just going to add this here, but I'm not going to go through this now because I want to save a little bit of time. One thing I want to add though is when it comes to something called name Cloud PC. This is not official from Microsoft yet, but there's been some rumors and some articles. But what I believe is that Microsoft is working on this, and this I believe will be the next version of Windows Virtual Desktop, where Microsoft will be providing a fully managed desktop as a service offering. So it will be built upon Windows Virtual Desktop. It will be providing Windows 10 as a service, different SKUs. The only thing that we need to add as a consumer of this service would be to set up a Windows 10 image and connect it from a network perspective to our existing infrastructure. So of course, there's no direct statement yet. There are some rumors and blogs, and me being one of those, where we'll also see a lot of changes to the underlying API, which can indicate they're working on something, and we'll be seeing something quite soon. So with that, I'm just going to jump ahead so we can have some few minutes to questions. Love as well if you can sign up for the VDI Like a Pro and answer the survey, because we give a lot of insight and feedback on what's your overall, what's happening in the overall EUC ecosystem and community. There's also a lot of good research being done on the goeuc.com blog, where they actually look into how different security mechanisms actually affect an end user setting or an end user session. So trying to summarize, of course, what we see is that like more customers moving to a cloud-based ecosystem, of course, they will also increase complexity. In addition to that, they have existing on-premises environments, which of course will increase the risk. And we see that a lot of vendors now are moving to like a zero trust-based architecture and design, and SASE being the core component that they want to provide moving forward, where they have these different capabilities in place to optimize traffic flow, provide inline-based security, but also providing actions or workflows instead of actually providing access to all the different applications. So I'm trying to figure up a good name for this specific platform ecosystem, but hopefully we'll find a new way or a new naming standard for this sometime soon. But again, looking at the current state of things, we'll still have a far way ahead before we actually have one single way for our end users to be able to access all their applications or the actions that they want to do to make their to get their work done. So with that, I think I've gotten to the end of the content I want to go through. Again, all this content and presentation is already published on this URL. And if you have any follow-up questions that I can't answer afterwards, well, feel free to drop me an email or send me a shout out on Twitter. So should we look at some questions, Jake?
Yeah, sounds awesome. Yeah, just I guess to reiterate what I'm sure everyone is thinking, but thank you. That was an awesome presentation. Certainly lots of food for thought there as well. I've written down a few questions actually, if that's okay. I think
yeah, that's good.
One I'd be really interested to get your take on is what you think the biggest change in the last year, obviously, since you did this State of the Union presentation last year. What do you think has been the biggest change that you've seen this year?
Of course, the shift from working from the offices and working from home, and of course, how can we provide the same level of security from our employees now working from home? I think that's been the biggest change. And of course, I saw that I think Microsoft released something called the security report in September last year, where they looked through, okay, there's been a lot of COVID-related attacks now trying to attack end users working from home, where they might be working on a home computer, where they might not have the same level of security. And now seeing vendors, okay, we need to address this issue. So what kind of capabilities should we provide, and what kind of security mechanism should we have in place? So like looking at the vendors now, I see that everybody's focusing on, okay, how can we secure this type of work experience?
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I mean, do you think then security, for example, will become the kind of the 2021 priority? I guess, 2020 was kind of the year of mobility, probably not through choice for everyone, but just with the way of the world. I mean, and 2021, I mean, I guess, with your crystal ball.
Yeah, and I agree. That's like 2021 is going to be the big year for security, and of course, this is my personal opinion, but like looking into SolarWinds and how that affected organizations worldwide, even Microsoft, and then we now saw Exchange, which of course is a pretty big used enterprise solution in most organizations, and now the world is fixed on looking into finding new vulnerabilities all the time. So I believe that we'll have a lot more focus on security this year, and bridging the gap now between that the user can actually work from anywhere, but also be secure from anywhere as well.
Yeah, I guess traditionally security was, we've got AV on our servers and we've got a firewall, but it doesn't work
exactly.
so much when people are out and about. Just a couple of questions from the audience that have just come in here, actually. One from Mike here says, can you expand on the shift that you mentioned, away from apps and desktops to tasks and workflows, and perhaps just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I can use a personal experience there, because within my company, I for some reason got access to our CRM system, and we're using Microsoft CRM, and I have no idea where to actually look for the information that I want to get. So of course, like one of the main models for each of the EUC vendors is that, hey, we will provide you with access to any type of any application that you have, regardless if you're running in cloud or running in an on-prem environment. But of course, I don't want access to all those applications. I want to be able to access to do that specific action that I need to have. I might for one example, I only need to get access to a certain part of that application, or only be able to do a specific task. So that if I can have a vendor that can just take that specific action that I want and make that visible for me, so that way I don't need to navigate through a CRM system. I just want to do that specific task. That would be extremely helpful. And this is, of course, the type of workflows that Citrix and VMware now are working on. And one thing I forgot to mention is that Microsoft as well is working on this capability, but they want to interface this into Microsoft Teams. So they're also working in the same type of workflow, publishing workflows instead.
That sort of micro apps architecture, I suppose, or almost taking that a step further, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Just another one that's coming here from Cristiano. What's your opinion about sort of service provider desktop as a service then? I mean, can they really compete? You've got kind of the big players now. Obviously, Amazon have an offering, Microsoft have an offering, there's Citrix Cloud as well. Can they really compete? I suppose in terms of, standing up to those large providers.
That is a good question that I'm asking myself a lot, because we are actually a service provider as well. So of course, I think that the role from a service provider as well has changed quite a lot the last couple of years now, with these hyperscalers coming in and providing a lot of the same functionality as type of bread and butter features, which we have specialized in for a long time. Of course, as I said initially, these desktop as a service offerings is well, they're not that fully customizable. And of course, we still see a lot of use cases where, okay, I could really use like a traditional Citrix environment or traditional Horizon environment now, which is not something that the cloud-based providers have. And of course, in addition to this, the Schrems 2 Act, which is specifically in Europe, is also playing a role here when it comes to governments and public or the regional public and public sector, I mean, which is scaring them away from using different cloud providers as well. So I think there's still some use cases, but I think that the cloud providers should be looking into, okay, how can I leverage what the cloud provider is actually providing to build more capabilities or other solutions on top.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. Yeah, I mean, Cristiano's just put a comment here as well, saying, you know, similar to what you have, that the sort of fine tuning and customizations and that close partnership that the providers can, the more bespoke providers can have with their customers is kind of their, you know, unique selling point, really. Just one more question here, and this is from Stefan. Do you feel that sort of APIs and those kind of open access type technologies that give, you know, people the ways to consume and build on these platforms in a more kind of customizable and more open way are going to play a bigger role moving forward?
That would be foolish of me to say no, but but yeah, I think it's definitely going to play a role. And you know, one of the interesting things I find from Microsoft perspective, because they have their Power Apps platform, right? So, and also they have the Power Automation, which provides like low code or no code mechanism, so that any type of employee, regardless of where they're in the organization, as long as they have a computer, they can start making applications or making automation.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things that they also introduced is that, okay, from Microsoft Teams, either if it's running Power Automate or Forms or apps, Power Apps, it can integrate with any type of API management. So that way that those new applications that are being built can also consume APIs, but of course it's abstract and made a lot easier for the consumer. But we also see that these type of API integrations will be included a lot more moving forward. And of course, we also see this like when we're using, and it's one of the main things that was missing in WVD when it was first announced, is that, okay, it's not an Azure native citizen, so I don't have a lot of APIs that I can actually use to actually automate the setup of these types of environments. So of course, when BVD became a cloud Azure native citizen, then we got a lot of APIs that we can leverage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. I think we've got a quiz question as well. So.
Yeah, as I said, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me directly. So as you said, it's an aspect of time. I guess, Stephanie, you have a quiz question that you want to ask the audience.
I do, and I want to get my question panel popped out so I can see it before I put the question up, because I know how this works. Let me share my screen. So I have one question, and the first 3 people to answer this question correctly, hold on, this shows me, doesn't seem like it's showing you anything. Good trivia question, right? Try this again. Looks like it's not wanting to show that one. Oh, there it is in the wrong screen. Okay, maybe you can see it. I'll try to get it over there. Okay. So what is the term? There you go. What is the term? I think, Marius, you pronounce it SASE. I'm not sure how you really pronounce it.
I think
what does it mean? All right, the first 3. So it looks like Eva, self-addressed stamped envelope. That's what it used to mean. Eva, Jesse, and Chris. So I will reach out to you. Congrats. Thanks for paying attention today, by the way. I will reach out to you after the webinar and get your information, and we'll get that sent. All right, awesome. Thanks, guys. I also am putting in the chat really quickly 2 links for you. One is a link to our survey. It's short, anonymous, for CUGC use only, so please fill it out. We just like to get your feedback. And also there's a field in there for you to write down any topics that you would like to hear about in the rest of this year. So we're always looking for, ideas. People want to present to the community all the time, so it's good when we know exactly what you guys want to hear about. So fill that out. And then I put also a link in there to the CUGC events calendar. You can find everything that we're involved in there. So hopefully we'll see you all again on another event soon. And with that, I can give you all back to your day. Thank you so much, Marius. It was good to have you back. And thank you, Jake, for being here again to moderate those questions.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So cheers.
All right, everyone. I hope you all stay happy, healthy, and safe, and enjoy your day. And we'll see you at another CUGC event soon. Bye.